Prince Reza Pahlavi, you're here in Germany for a conference, but let's start talking about what happened in the past weeks. Was there a day where you were hopeful that the regime could really fall?
It's always been, to me, a matter of when as opposed to if. And the simple reason for it is because if historically you look at totalitarian regimes, ultimately they succumb. We saw the end of the Soviet Union, and we've seen an end to many unwanted regimes, particularly when we have to face a regime that is purely ideologically a regime that tried to export this ideology at the expense of its own people. And from the very beginning, Iranians were faced with so much discrimination that came along with it, so much repression that came along with it. And when you look historically, that this regime is a combination of the worst kind of regimes we ever had on the planet. You know, whether it was Hitler and his, behavior, or the Soviet Union or South Africa, in any aspect of, fascism or totalitarianism or racism, this regime embodies all of the worst examples in history that we have had of the worst type of regime. So can you imagine the response that people of that country would have? And I think the world as well, when they look at it.
You were very vocal during the bombings, and you said people, should go out and stand against the regime. But we didn't see many people demonstrating on the streets. We didn't see a movement. Is that because the regime is still very strong and people are afraid? Or is there still a lot of support for the regime, what you don't see?
Well, I mean, during the military campaign when Iran was targeted, and people, in fact, they had to leave the city. You cannot imagine that under the circumstances you can have organized street demonstrations. Although a few weeks after, now, as I speak to you, again we see various diverse form of manifestations that Iranians keep on going. There's been, as of late, some demonstrations in the north of Iran for, again, water shortages. I remember the Caspian. This is one of the most water-related ample regions of our country. I mean, if you go to the north of Iran, you think you're in Thailand. So lush and so forest and water. And yet there are water shortages even in that province as we speak. People are faced daily with electricity ruptures. No gas has been delivered. They cannot even live, let alone work. And this is something that keeps on going. Yes, the regime was severely emasculated, which is good because it equals the playing field for people. So the momentum is still there. And I'm sure you've been witness to it as a reporter, as a journalist, that there are always ebbs and flows when there are campaigns of that nature. But the momentum keeps going. And as I explained to you earlier, before we came on air, it's a multi-pronged campaign. It has various components, and many wheels are in motion as I speak to you. And a lot of what we will discover is as a result of the regime's weakening. And now that the playing field has been more equal for the people, there will be more opportunities now to galvanize and orchestrate themselves. And the regime repressive apparatus has been severely weakened. Not that they will keep on repressing, they do. In fact, they are taking revenge on the people right now in some form or shape. But reason more for people to realize that this is an opportunity not to miss.
What do you hear from inside the regime? Do you have contacts? Do you have people telling you what's really happening?
Yes, and not only do we reach out, but now we've been reached too. That defection campaign that has begun when I announced it almost a month ago when I was in Paris during a press conference, we have received a lot of inquiries, and that data is right now being, as I speak to you, analyzed as exactly what ranks in the military or paramilitary or the civilian bureaucracy are reaching out. And I think the reason this is important is because outside of what people are doing in terms of organizing themselves in demonstrations, but a big part of my strategy post-regime and transition is what fills the gap once this regime is no longer there. And most of these elements that can then be those who fill the gap are important in that equation, and we are talking to them and reaching out to them and see what we can do together.
How do people from inside the regime defect? I mean, how does that work?
Well, the first mechanism is to provide them with a secure way of communicating, because we need to protect their identity for obvious reasons. So that's a delicate matter. So we're trying to do it very cautiously and taking all the security precautions necessary.
But how does it work? Do they call a number on?
There's a safe platform through which they can contact and identify themselves and the way we can communicate with them. And as a result, once we engage with them, then the next step is what exactly can they be doing in their respective position when it is time for them to actually surface and openly manifest themselves. I mean, clearly, when you're dealing with this kind of regime, you're trying to protect your assets within the country as much as possible, because you don't want them to prematurely expose themselves. So it's a matter of timing that also comes into play. Having said that, you have, of course, a visible part of the opposition, but you also have an invisible part of the structure that have to remain protected in their identity, so that at the right time they can do whatever they're supposed to do.
So the situation inside Iran with the regime, how is it developing right now?
We sense a lot of demoralized forces. The supreme leader himself has been hiding in his bunker. Our sources tell us that he's been heavily medicated. He's in a very bad shape, psychologically very depressed, and is receiving special treatment for that, apart from his normal ailments. So things are not looking good for the top echelon of the leadership. It's really crumbling around him. There are internal rivalries already starting in terms of accusing one another or posturing versus one another. It has become quite fragile and at the same time weakened. So whatever it is that are right now calculating, I think part of it is whether or not they want to still maintain that element of pressure by intimidating people or threatening people, or once again trying to cut them off from the rest of the world in terms of communication, things like that. But the elements within the system now is surpassing it. The economic crisis in Iran continues to be going on. As I said, we're in the summer months, extreme heat and temperature. There's no gas, there's no electricity, there's no water. And that situation by itself makes it much more unstable, and the regime has no answer for those questions. So that at the same time, dealing with that external pressure, they have to deal with all these problems. I think right now they're just overloaded with problems, and that's why we think that this is a moment where they won't be able to do anything any more harmful to the country in the sense of opportunities for people to rise.
Do you know where Khamenei exactly is? His location in the bunker? Do you think he's in the bunker since weeks, months?
It's been reported that in a couple of times he was moved to a different location. We don't know exactly the specifics, but he finally came out a little while ago to manifest himself, because a lot of people, even within his own group, would say, "What the hell is he doing? Well, where is he?" They were looking out for him, and that was interpreted as a sign of almost like giving up. So they're playing the psychological game as always.
Do you think there was a plan from Israel to kill him? Because it was reported that there was the possibility for the Israeli military to kill him, and that Trump told Israel to back off.
That seems to be the case, yes. And I think that took a little bit of the momentum out, because I think a lot of people thought that this could go, in fact, all the way. Now, retrospectively thinking, you could say that perhaps once you take one person out, then the question becomes, who's the next person? As opposed to, well, he's still there, weakened, enraged, and easier to target in a system that everything depends on the supreme leader. So there are pros and cons as to whether he should be there or not be there. That's a separate calculation. My focus, on the other hand, is that irrespective of whether Khamenei is taken out or not, it doesn't change the nature of our struggle. It doesn't change the goal of our campaign. The dynamics of it and the necessity for that transition remains the same, irrespective of whether Ali Khamenei is alive or dead. And because, this is the totality of the system once again, that is the problem. Not necessarily that if one individual is replaced by another, that would resolve the problem, either for the regime or change the nature of our campaign. So these are all the side, factors and variables, but it doesn't change in any form or shape the way we are conducting our campaign.
How do you see the strategy of the regime right now? I mean, they're trying to reach out to European partners. They've been talking to the German foreign ministry and to the German foreign ministry even. They're reaching out to contacts inside the US. So it looks like they want to talk again. How would you describe?
There's nothing new to that pattern of behavior. If you analyze the last 40 years, every time the regime has had its back to the wall, it has basically gone to their default strategy of buying time. And part of that strategy of buying time is trying to trick the world yet again, leading them to think that maybe this time we're really serious about negotiating with you. They've done that systematically. If you look at every time they've done that, which leads me to say that there's no reason for us to believe that this time they really mean to be honest about we're serious about negotiating a problem. I think this is yet again an indication that under pressure, they're letting some steam out and giving them a false hope that perhaps this time we have an opportunity to settle the problem with them, only in the interest of buying time.
And why is the West buying that, you think?
Again, because I think there is this sort of status quo-ish mentality that has been prevailing in Western diplomacy in general, which is all based on the initial premise of an expectation of behavior change that has lasted for the past 40 years. If you look at it, every aspect of the foreign policy of the West in general, by the West I mean the United States and its European allies, vis-a-vis this regime, from the very beginning, and from the first time that sanctions were imposed on the regime. It was not based on expecting a change of regime in Iran or even pursuing that as an alternative, but rather let's expect a change of behavior by this regime. And that's why it has never worked, because the whole premise is wrong to begin with. This regime simply cannot change its behavior. It cannot reform itself. It cannot adhere to the same values and principles and rationale that the Western free world expects a government to behave like, particularly that this regime doesn't give a hoot about the Iranian people. It's not there for the benefit of its country. It's just using our national resources, our peoples, as a human shield to basically foment their strategy of exporting their ideology from day one. For the past 40 years, that's what the regime has done. And the world needs to recognize now that the ultimate solution to the problem is not attempting yet again to throw a lifeline to this regime and try to negotiate a deal with them, as opposed to the ultimate solution is for this regime to be no longer there. Not only it liberates one nation, but it also it resolves most of the problems you have with this regime, whether it's the nuclear threat, radicalism, terrorism, funding of various elements, all the way to European soil and even beyond in the Western Hemisphere. That's what the regime has proven to do systematically. So I think if you fall yet again for the regime's tactic of buying more time and delaying the problem, the rest of the problems will not dissipate. It will continue to remain.
Let's talk about the nuclear threat. That's the reason why the US bombed the facilities. What do you know about the situation on the ground? How much is it damaged? Like, there's different analyses on that.
The way I will describe it is that it's been severely curtailed, but it hasn't disappeared. For two reasons. Number one, yes, some of the nuclear sites were heavily damaged, but that doesn't stop the regime's resolve to continue enrichment. In fact, they declared it. They said, we're not only going to stop it, they practically have doubled down on it. So much for an expectation of full capitulation that was Donald Trump's expectation, that there's absolutely no way possible that we would even allow that. It doesn't seem that the regime has got a message despite the fact that they were attacked. So that's going on. Number two, there's no guarantee that this regime could not acquire nuclear weapons, even if it means by acquisition from some of the partners they have in that struggle. So it's not a matter of them. personal capabilities of either enrich or be able to deploy their missile technology. So that doesn't make the problem disappear. Because as long as they have the resources, they can certainly acquire it in a different way. The problem, as I said, is the finger on the trigger at the end of the day. It's the regime itself that cannot be trusted, regardless of what signature they put on any document or any contract. And this is probably the root cause why you even have an anticipation of snapback, because it was geared on the premise that can we really trust them at the end of the day? Why would there have been a clause for a snapback if you thought that this regime could this time solve the problem and, everything goes back to normal? There's a reason for that. And I think part of it is based on the fact that even though they recognize that the verification process has to happen, and how many times has the regime been dubious about being transparent about things? Even the IAEA people could tell you that. This all ties to the whole nuclear fiasco that exists right now.
And there were different reports that they were able actually to bring the uranium somewhere else before the attack happened. And there was reports that they're not as damaged as Trump hoped. And
yes, and I would concur with that analysis. That it's not been accounted for where it is. I mean, this is just bits and pieces of the entire problem. I mean, if you want to really dwell into it, there are many other reasons to believe that this problem has not evaporated overnight, regardless of the consequences of the Israelis.
Is it possible to destroy it all from your point of view?
But if the whole premise is based on can we completely eliminate the problem of the nuclear threat emanating from this regime while it is still there, the only thing I can say is that this regime still being there means a continuation of the problem. And you cannot base your policy on the degree of weakness of a regime as opposed to the inherent threat built into the nature of the regime. And as long as we don't realize that, it's a false imagination on an artificially created environment that, we cannot justify our diplomacy because we can now prove to the world there's no longer a nuclear threat coming from Iran because such and such installation was hit. That's not the case as far as I'm concerned.
Talking about regime change, there was back in June lots of discussions about it, even from the Israeli side. When I was there reporting from there, there was the Minister of Defense actually saying that, there should be a regime change. Then the president said, no, this is not our goal. Then Prime Minister Netanyahu back down. And same in the US. There's some people from the Congress saying we need a regime change, but at the same time Trump said, no way, we don't want regime change. We remember what happened in Iraq, so there's nothing we want to do. So it looks like this will not happen from abroad. There will be no push on that. And we see what's happening in the past weeks. They all push for negotiations.
Okay, on that, there's a lot to say. So let me first start by the fact that I think there's no other country on this planet that recognizes more why it is that this regime is a menace, and why is it that the people of Iran are a friend. The recognition between a regime that hates America, hates the Jewish state and the Jews, as opposed to a nation that once liberated, will prove that they could be the best friends of Israel and the United States. Point number one. Point number two is the fact that, yes, we have seen recent cases of regime change very poorly managed. Example, the Ba'athification after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Very poorly administered. And that gave regime change a bad name. Not that it's a bad concept. It's still the right thing to do. But it was so badly implemented.
Well, but it never worked.
And so, when it comes to Iran, number one, Iran is not Iraq. Iran is not a country where we say, we expect America to send its soldiers, so it's the boots on the ground from the American perspective. Of a U.S. taxpayer, I happen to be one of them, by the way. I don't want my money to be spent on endless campaigns of military presence abroad and so on and so forth. Our boots on the ground are the people of Iran. And the resources needed to fund it doesn't have to be a U.S. or British or German taxpayer. It is actually, a lot of it could be frozen assets that belongs to the Iranian people in the first place that could be repurposed to fund many of these campaigns.
But we don't see any big uprising if you say that the people of Iran...
Because every time there was one, the world basically threw them under the bus.
You
Look,
mean
it's not the first
2022?
time. During the Green Movement, the Mahsa Revolution, and every time when you look at it from the perspective of the Iranian people, they're reaching out to the free world. They say, where are you on this? Why aren't you on our side? And
But what do you mean with being on their side? So on the one hand, you say you don't want boots on the ground. So what is?
I'm trying to explain it to you. Again, I have never asked any foreign government to declare as their foreign policy that it is regime change. Let me be clear on that. Whether it's the US government or any European government, or for that matter, any other government. What I ask them to do is to show solidarity with the aspiration of a nation that wants the very same value systems that you as a German, or Donald Trump as an American, or President Macron as a French, or the British Prime Minister's citizen enjoy the freedoms, the democratic values, liberties that they have for our own country.
Well, I would say in 2022,
with that.
In 2022, I saw a lot of solidarity from politicians, but also from normal German people. So the solidarity doesn't bring a revolution.
But it starts with that.
Change.
It starts with that. Look, wasn't there a regime change in South Africa? Wasn't there a regime change in the Soviet Union? Wasn't there a regime change in Poland and many of the former Eastern Bloc countries once liberated from the yoke of communist totalitarianism? Those were all regime changes. And guess what? The free world did support it. They did support Nelson Mandela. They did support Lech Walesa. They did support many of these causes that liberated those countries. So if regime change is bad, then we should say an end of apartheid was wrong, an end of totalitarian communism was wrong, and in that case, ending a regime in Iran that has kept our countries hostages and has menaced the world with its terrorism and radicalism, that should be wrong. Is that our conclusion?
But what I would argue is that, you mentioned it earlier, that it has to start from inside.
Of course, it's still the same thing.
And I would argue that the regime is still so strong that people from inside the regime are afraid of, going against Khamenei or other people, because they don't know what would happen after it, and they would be afraid that their own they'll be targeted from your side or other side.
I'm glad you're framing it this way, because it's exactly what people like myself and the rest of the democratic forces working together on this project are trying to explain to the world, and of course to our own nation, that unlike the element that would have created or has created a void post a regime collapse. Again, I point back to the example of Iraq, that we have a plan to tell our fellow compatriots and the entire world that post-regime collapse is not going to be chaos, it's not going to be an unknown, that we can point to the direction of exactly how this transition can happen. How can that void be populated? So you don't have to be concerned about the aftermath of this regime collapse. And a lot of that depends, of course, in our success in our campaign to recruit those elements that can now be on the people's side as opposed to on the regime side. And the people see that and they do recognize that.
But you're talking about a possible collapse of the regime. Where do you see that? Why would the regime collapse? Because they're there since 47 years now.
Who benefits from this regime being in place in Iran? If you look at elements within the country that actually benefits from this regime being in power, and most of it is for monetary reasons, because they actually have a monetary interest to preserve the system to their own interest. It's the top echelon of this corrupt paramilitary mafia that governs the nation, at the expense of a nation that is oil-rich, that is gas-rich, and yet 60% of our society lives under the poverty line. Where is the money concentrated in? In the hands of the few and not the many. So you're talking about a very narrow strata that is part of the regime's root support that benefits from this regime being in place. But if you look at the bulk of the cadres of whether it's the civilian bureaucracy or whether it is the military and paramilitary forces, they don't have any interest in this system. And the ideological beliefs, if they once had it, is completely eradicated. And that's why if you are a member of the military, if you're a member of the IRGC, and you see that this regime is on the verge of collapse, that the people are literally at the spot of explosion, you ask yourself, why should I endure anymore? That humility and face the music one time, the people will rise, will be their first target, and the long top echelon will be long gone and take flight and go seek refuge wherever it is.
But at the end, you need people in front of a bunker or a palace, or you need demonstration, you need uprising. That's how regimes everywhere in the world fell.
And then when it comes to world solidarity, somebody like myself is trying to come here to explain to governments, look, this is what could happen. We've been muzzled, we've been cut off because the excuse of the foreign ministries of these countries that, we have to manage the problem. We have hostages over there. If we put more pressure, they're going to blackmail us yet again. We cannot do this. We cannot do that. We cannot engage in dialogue. So basically, once again, those freedom fighters and those of us fighting for freedom are being sacrificed for the sake of political expediency. So the nature of the foreign politics also has a direct bearing on how we can be sooner successful than not. Not that I'm saying that Iranians' liberation depends on the good will of this or that country. I've always said it, even to my own compatriots, that we can only rely on ourselves, but it would be so much easier for us if we had the world on ourselves.
How long will it take?
It could happen very fast. It could happen very, very fast
But nothing looks like it would happen fast.
Well, look, orchestrating such a campaign demands that many wheels comes into motion, as I explained to you earlier. And right now, when the regime has been severely weakened, we are now assessing what are the new opportunities that we haven't had until about 2 months ago.
Which are
the regime's severe fragmentation. That the targets, if you look at the campaign, was not just targeting Iranian nuclear site. It actually targeted many instances that the regime utilizes for surveillance and as an instrument of repression against its own citizenry. The top commanders have been taken out. This is a very hard thing for a regime to replace overnight.
There's new commanders coming, and there's new commanders now, and the regime is striking back. People from inside...
It's never the same. You cannot repopulate so suddenly when there's so en masse been decimated. Now, it's almost like, if I were here to tell you about the anatomy of how a repressive regime manages to survive, you have to get into their mindset and their strategy. What I'm talking about is what can we take advantage of? When I say we, I mean the opportunity for the people to rise based on A, the regime's weakness. Number two, the fact that the world may in fact bring even more pressure on the regime. We are exploring right now by the end of this month coming, if the regime doesn't suddenly and very radically change its attitude and posture, we can contemplate snapback being reinstated again. These are all elements that makes life more difficult for the regime and directly and consequentially easier for the people for opportunities.
But at the same time, what we hear from Iran is that the regime is striking back, that it's more aggressive than ever. I mean, we heard about executions.
Of course they do. They do retaliate against the people because they're still playing the same waiting game. They're trying to buy time vis-a-vis the outside world. So in the meantime, they can re-engage in a politics of fear against the people by saying, despite what you think, we're still capable of hitting you. But this is sheer madness revenge. They're arresting citizens left and right under the guise that these are Israeli spies or Mossad agents or what have you.
But this is how it worked in many countries. I mean, not that I can compare dictatorships or authoritarian regimes with each other, but if we see what happened in Russia, for example, or...
aren't you then a little bit surprised if you were an Iranian that somebody like Donald Trump, that on the one hand supports the Israeli campaign of striking Iran, all of a sudden says, now stop it, these are good guys, we can come to terms with them. Demonstrating that many leaders in the world think that simply because you have, in their own mind, eliminated one element who was a bone of contention, things can go back to business as usual, and problem is resolved. Again, it shows to me that understanding the nature of this regime and its continuance, how much consequences this could have, reinforces my argument of why, at the end of the day, this regime has to go. Now, again, let me repeat, I'm not expecting Donald Trump or the German Chancellor or anybody else for that matter to declare that our foreign policy is based on declaring regime change in Iran. That's not what I'm asking for. What I do ask for, however, is for your Chancellor, the American President, his allies, and our regional partners who recognize that at the end of the day, once this regime is gone, not one but many problems associated with it would also disappear, can take opportunity of a window, which is right now in front of us, where the regime in 46 years has never been as weak as it is, and the nation has never been as ready as it is today. And there are additional components that are added to this that we haven't had until recent years. Two factors. One is that many former reformists who still believe that by some ways we can bring change from within have given up on that idea. That narrative is now finished, despite what some of the talking heads of the regime are trying to lead you to believe. That is gone. And number two, I think that I don't have an immediate concrete answer for you, but based on the data that I will analyze of all these new defectors, how much more can we count on these elements now being a positive additional element in our campaign that is taking away from the regime to the benefit of the nation? So it's always a direct rapport de force, as the French will say, between the regime's capabilities and the opposition abilities. And we are witnessing that as we speak. We are gearing up towards that momentum. And eventually, what you say we need to see, you as a journalist watching from the outside, or any expectation that the world has, is that movement finally going to be more manifest in Iran? I guarantee you it will. And in fact, there are some elements of it. Is it at the level of full combination? We're building towards that. And what we hope is that in the meantime, as we're gearing up for that, the world doesn't yet again throw this regime another lifeline, because this will simply delay our ability to liberate ourselves. And meanwhile, the other problems emanated with the regime. So, diplomacy or not, they need to recognize, and that's what I would like to draw a parallel to the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union. They have to have a strategy for what if the regime was to collapse. But none of these countries have that strategy as I speak to you.
I still haven't understood what exactly Donald Trump or Friedrich Merz and others should do from your perspective, because you're saying no regime change, they don't have to mention it. It's not important if they mention it. You say no boots on the ground. You say solidarity, but this is very vague. I mean, solidarity doesn't make a revolution.
Let me give you the specifics. Maximum pressure. What was maximum pressure? Maximum pressure mean more sanctions on the regime. One of them, the most biggest elephant in the room, is subscribing the IRGC. The G6 have yet to do that, despite the fact that the EU Parliament and many other legislators have actually said that we should prescribe the IRGC. The excuse that we hear, because I talked about it and asked some of former politicians, why is it that you're not prescribing the IRGC as a terrorist organization, which gives you much more forensic depth of actually identifying their networks and their footprints, whether it's operating in Europe or elsewhere. And it goes back again to this whole hostage issue, or we don't want to lose our diplomatic access to the regime because we have a chancery there, and so on and so forth. To me, I think these are lame excuses. It's just not facing up to the reality that the leverage you can have against the regime, you're caving in under a policy of blackmail by the regime of taking your hostages, and that makes you hesitant about doing something that is the most obvious element that could severely curtail the regime, which is one of them is prescribing the IRGC as part of your maximum pressure campaign. Now, maximum pressure from the outside is one thing. What about maximum support? There are many things that the free world can do to help the Iranian people in their cause. For instance, we have seen time and again that one of the most critical aspects for the Iranian people is not to be disconnected from the world and the ability to communicate with one another. We talked about the importance of having access to the internet. We talked about Starlink being in Iran. As a matter of fact, by the way, side note, if you own a Starlink platform right now, you're subject to arrest and it's a crime. it's no longer a problem. I mean, that's how the regime retaliates. They know how important it is. That's an indication of how critical it is for people to have access. That's one thing that free world can help us with. I talked to you about earlier about you don't need to have boots on the ground. The people are on the ground. You don't need to fund it by taxpayers' money, but you can repurpose frozen assets to sustain and fund, for instance, labor strikes in Iran, as an example. These are the things that are the tools of how you can galvanize a nation. This goes hands in glove in terms of what posture a foreign government can take to facilitate. Because right now, sanctions make it very difficult for anyone to send money back home to, let's say, sponsor the family of a political prisoner or somebody who wants to go on strike. These are areas that they can cooperate with the opposition. And these are the kind of substantial examples of what I'm giving you, just some examples of what can be done that they could implement in terms of a strategy and policy.
Why do you think that you are the right person at this moment to unite this opposition? Because you're the son of the Shah, also authoritarian regime, and many people still remember what happened during that period of time, also in the West.
But I think that the names that has been chanted in Iran, apart from my grandfather and my father, is mine. And this is the name that they write on the walls in Iran as I speak. These are what people are chanting in slogans in Iran. And if you monitor that, that should be evidence of why should it be me as opposed to person X. And, you know, that gives me the legitimacy to conduct this campaign.
But this was not a democracy back in the days. So, and you're talking about freedom now, and
whatever is the historical revision of what happened then, and I think today the Iranian people recognize what a crucial role my father and my grandfather played in modern Iran and giving everything that Iranian once enjoyed that they lost under this regime. All the liberties, women's rights, everything else. Was it a perfect system? No, it wasn't. But today people recognize that the country was going in a direction of prosperity, of progress, of modernity. And if that had continued without the revolution, Iran by now should have been the South Korea of the Middle East. Instead, we have become the North Korea of the Middle East. Why? Because that regime was gone, and instead, there was a regime that promised people free electricity, free rides on buses, and look at where it is now. And people respond and react to that.
But there's also people remembering of their loved ones being in prison during the time your father was there. So, I mean,
the statistics that were announced by the opposition back then were grossly exaggerated. And that's why we have people now that have gone and studied all those aspects that were by no means friends of the previous regime. In fact, they were the opposition to my father's regime, from the left, from the Marxists, from the Maoists. And if you look at what they came up with their analysis, it draws a totally different picture than a specific narrative that was pushed by, at the time, what was a coalition of the red and the black, the Marxists and the Islamists, who painted a picture of Iran. And in fact, a lot of people in the Western world were impacted by that rhetoric.
It's not only a picture they painted. I mean,
I'm not here to represent the past, number one. I'm my own man. I have my own vision. And that's why they respond to my message.
But you've been living in the West since you were 18. So how do you think you're the one for the people in Iran they can trust?
Because my life has been Iran for the past 46 years. I've been in touch with my fellow compatriots all this time. I've monitored every aspect from the day that Iran entered a war with Iraq. At the time I was in Cairo, my father had just died, and I volunteered to join the Iranian military to fight against Saddam Hussein and his invasion. And to this day, when today's kids, today's Gen Z, the children who were murdered during the Women Life Freedom Movement, their mothers were here in Munich 2 days ago. Their children were there 3 days ago. Who do you think they came and embraced? Whose name do you think that they bring up?
But
they bring my name up.
But there's even opposition groups in the past years.
So if they thought that I'm detached or I'm not connected to them or I live in a different world, that's not their take. That's not their interpretation. There may be some people in the Western media that may characterize it as such, but the reality is not that. In fact...
But how do you know the reality? And painting names on walls doesn't mean that the whole country is backing you or is behind you. You know, I mean, this is not numbers or facts.
Then I would refer you to some of the polls that have been made about where do I figure in terms of the overall perception. And if you look at that, I don't know exactly what the number is. But the second person closest to me, as far as being considered as someone, is not even recording in the double digits in most of the polls that have been done. So if you, to the extent that you're willing to believe whatever polls are showing, I think that's another way of demonstrating where do I stand vis-a-vis this popular response. And I'm not running for office anyway. It's not that I'm trying to campaign for anything. But when people look at me as a father figure, and that's what they call me these days, by the way, most of these kids, when they talk to me, they address me as father, meaning that they see that I can be unconditionally having their back. And I've been around for 46 years, and they value that. They appreciate that. They say, yeah, he could have gone and lived his life, but he hasn't.
Why is it
46 years he's been there fighting for us. And I think that's the recognition, that's the affection, that's the trust. That's the trust. Most important element. People have lost complete trust to anything, but they trust me. You know why? Because I've been consistent in my message, because I've never wavered from my commitment to their liberation, and it has never been about me.
Why is it that even opposition groups in the past, I remember 2022, criticizing you and saying Western politicians seeing in you the solution for Iran are very naive because they wouldn't see, the opposition against you and against what happened during the Shah time in Iran?
Well, many of them, if they had said that, were now standing with me a couple of years ago, looking at what we can do together. Even people who were clearly part and advocate of the regime have come out and say, we need to work with Reza Pahlavi. He's the only person who can take us to the point where we are finally liberated. Former, you want to call them enemies or adversaries, are today in our camp. Not my camp. It's a national project. This is not about me yet again. It's not about the monarchy. It's not about the past. It's about liberating our nation so we could have a secular, democratic future, which is the aspiration of my fellow compatriots.
Wouldn't it be important, if you want to unite everybody, that you also talk about what happened during the Shah time?
I have. I've written books about it. I'm on the record. I've been critical of many aspects of what happened before. If they only choose not to be selective about where it is that they use a quote by me and where they choose not to, because it happens to, in fact, debunk their entire narrative about the past. I've been on the record. I point you to my books, my interviews, and I've done that. So as far as that argument goes, I think the evidence is right there for everyone to see. And I'm not shying away from it. If you ask me right now what aspect I would criticize, I would still do. But this is not about writing history.
Yeah,
and I tell people, I'm not here to write history. I'm here to make history. And we are making history. And that's why yesterday's foes have become today's allies. Because we all recognize that we have to look forward. Learning, of course, learning from the mistakes of the past, so we can build a better future.
What was the biggest mistake, if you call it mistake, of your father?
Getting more participation, and I think that the level of economic development was not necessarily parallel to the level of liberalizing the system. Not that my father didn't want that. Let me be very clear about that. Why would he send all these young kids to be educated in Western universities, bring together with them the very same values that the free world has, if he didn't have the intent to, in fact, liberalize the country at the same time? He did that. My father implemented programs that were more socialist than any socialist
government. Now you're not talking about his mistakes. Now you're talking again about what he did right. I was asking you, what was his biggest mistake? What about the prisons? What about the people?
The level of liberalization. But also understand that this was in a climate of the Cold War, and many countries who lived to the life under Soviet dictatorship knew that there were elements in there, like the Tudeh Party, which was a communist party, taking direct order from Moscow to undermine our sovereignty and interfere in Iran affairs in the name of being not participating in the political sphere. But there were also innocent victims of that liberal expectation that also faced the same type of put aside. And I think that was a mistake, because that was one of the elements that created the political crisis. However, if you were to talk to these elements who said, well, the system was not free, liberty was not as such, we were not doing this, we're not doing that. It was perhaps political liberties, but there are also a lot of other aspects that did exist that now when they look back and they say, we should have taken the opportunity when the Shah finally said that, okay, I'm going to step back and allow for that to take place. Some people may argue, maybe by the time it was too late, but he did recognize that. And the opposition today recognizes that we should have taken advantage of that new opening rather than rally behind Khomeini as if he could be the instrument of Iran's liberalization. And by the time they recognize what the true nature of the regime was, it was by then too late. So, it goes both ways. You can be critical of what went wrong. I admit it. I volunteer it. I recognize it. So does the opposition. So it's not a one-way street. I think the opposition of the regime in the past also bears some responsibilities in the sense of where they went wrong as well. So I think rather than being in a position to accuse one another of wrongdoing, we should both sides recognize where we did right and where we did wrong. And as a result, understand why it is that now we need to work together. So not only we achieve what we always wanted, but don't repeat the mistakes that we made before collectively. So it's not a one-way street. It has to be. And that's the spirit of my campaign. It's based on national reconciliation. What does national reconciliation mean? It means that the people who until now thought that they cannot be on the same boat could in fact live under the same roof and be an instrument for a better future as opposed to a stumbling block towards that future. So that's the nature of what Iran had to go through in 46 years. And the fact that at the end of the tunnel, we all recognize that this is a gift to have had this experience, sometimes having paid a very heavy price, but it puts us in such a better shape now to then address the future. That's what I'm working on with the opposition, including those who yesterday were opposed to my father's regime.
You said it could happen very fast. Mm-hmm. I still would argue if there needs to be a special momentum, something, what happened inside the country. Another bombing campaign, I don't know, but what is it, what needs to happen, and that the uprising is really happening?
Again, I think part of it is an external component. So,
like what?
Let's say if snapback was to be implemented, how much more it would curtail the regime's abilities, but also if there's an actual dimension to the maximum support that I've been calling for all along, in what way it would have direct impact on people's ability to better organize
could it happen,
themselves?
for example?
Well, this is the reason how it can be accelerated rather than delayed. But You're asking me how soon, I'm telling you how it can be accelerated.
But we talked about Khamenei, for example. If he would be killed in the next weeks, months, the next year, is that something where you could think?
I don't think it's a stumbling block. It may, in fact, have a positive ramification in the sense that the regime is even more fragile in terms of finding the replacement, so to speak. Some people would like to see him alive to see the demise of his regime and face the music and answer in a court of law for all the crimes he has committed. So some people, in fact, would like him to one day see that. So honestly, if you ask me, I don't care either way whether Khamenei is alive or dead. The regime is dying, and his regime is dying. And the people of Iran are seeing this as an opportunity not to be missed. And we are doing everything we can as Iranians to mobilize ourselves. We hope, however, that the world this time is not going to say, wait a second, we have to somehow figure out a diplomatic way out. And if that doesn't work, we're going to go and strike Iran again militarily. And once again, the Iranian people are not part of the alternative analysis and equation.
Did it hurt you with the opposition aligning with Israel and the US during the bombing campaign? Because also many civilians died in June and people...
Well, we didn't have to align. And understand one thing, I have warned time and again, not only my fellow compatriots, but also the world, that if you continue a political appeasement vis-a-vis this regime, if you continue thinking that you can resolve the problem by negotiating with them, if you continue by releasing funds that they shouldn't have had access to begin with, which happened under the Biden administration. Over $200 billion came to the hand of the regime to use it to maintain its proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas. And October 7th was not a coincidence. It was a result of that. So we then are forced with a scenario that some countries, like Israel, would have to take a step to alleviate the problem. I warned about that it should not come to a conflict. But you jumped directly, yet again, from failed diplomacy to now military conflict. And all these years before we reached what happened a couple months ago, I've been telling Americans, Europeans, and other people, there is a third way. And that third way is to help the Iranian people.
Could Israel help to overthrow this regime?
Yes, they can. So can America, so can Europe. It all depends on how you reassess your policy and your strategy. The strategy should no longer be based on appeasement and trying to find a scenario of diplomatic resolution.
Could, at the end of our interview, we're in Germany right now, is there anything what Germany should do, what the chancellor should do, the foreign minister should do right now?
I think leadership has been, in terms of courageous leadership, taking a strong position, really absent in the European theater when I come to think of it. Look, we've seen time and again how critical it is to have the element of true strength mobilize and change the momentum and face of history. The last time I saw it was when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher came and pretty much forced their hands on Mr. Gorbachev, and ultimately it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Thatcher couldn't do it alone. Ronald Reagan couldn't do it alone. And if you look at Donald Trump right now, and if you're looking at what Putin is doing in Moscow, what the Communist Party is doing in China, what in counterbalance to those blocs is the West doing? The West right now, and most of Europe, is not showing the kind of courage it takes to be strong and not allow a regime to blackmail you by taking hostages, leading you to think that they are not honest about coming to negotiation, because meantime Iranian people are getting killed and the rest of the region is suffering, and you have all sorts of human situation developing. Gaza is not off my radar. I really feel bad for what's happening there as a consequence of the status quo. And I think part of the blame should come to the very same governments that through their laissez-faire and appeasement have been responsible somewhat in the tragedy that is happening now. Because they allowed for the regime in Iran to survive all these years by funding these terrorists, by funding those elements of repression that then forces the government to react. So let's one time blame not the victims, but those who are responsible for this crime. And there's none other than the Islamic regime in Iran that some in the West still think they can reason with. And all this time, I'm saying you have wasting time, and all of that means more human casualties. All of this means more forced migration that Europe can hardly handle, all of because the status quo continuing. Why don't you think that you can, for once in 46 years, alter your thinking and anticipate that what could be the benefit of this change? You want to make sure it's not mayhem. We have a solution for that. You want to make sure it's not crisis after collapse. It's not going to be another Iraq. Every area of concern that you may have, we have an answer for it. All you need to do is to decide to discontinue a policy of appeasement and throwing a lifeline to the regime, to the benefit of now standing in solidarity with this country. And you will see that most of the problems will be resolved that will not need you to sacrifice some principles or, for that matter, have to utilize force. Because the biggest guarantee are the people of Iran once liberated that will demonstrate that, unlike this regime, they are not a threat to the Western world and Western values and Western belief. In fact, they espouse it. That there are, in a population in Germany, the chancellor knows that there's almost 500,000 Iranians who are now German citizens who live in this country, many of whom want to go back to Iran once liberated. And they are all successful entrepreneurs, doctors. They're part and parcels of what makes Germany a strong country. You have actually human assets that could then be the best ambassadors for the relationship between our liberated country and a country like Germany. And any other country in Europe probably will have the same kind of sentiment. All it takes is for the kind of leadership who said, we have had it with this regime. Basta, as the Spanish would say. It is time we give the Iranian people the opportunity that they well deserve. You don't have to do anything beyond that. Just recognize that delaying the problem by thinking that this regime will this time offer you the solution is the wrong approach. It's just wasting time. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you and the Iranian people all the best. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.